Hi, I'm David Mayer, a Senior Technical Project Manager here at Fictiv. We're back again for another Teardown. In this clean-shaven episode, we're celebrating Father's Day and tearing apart two of the top electric shavers on the market, the Braun Series 7 and the Philips Norelco S9311. As usual with our teardowns, we're putting these two products head-to-head from an engineering point of view, but for this special episode, we also wanted to bring in some fatherly advice and got the first Fictiv employee who became a dad to come in and volunteer his face to see which one is a better shaver.
Thanks, David. Let's do this. Yeah, I think that for me, if I had to buy one...
To hear Panos' final thoughts on which one gave the best shave, make sure to stay tuned to the very end. And now for my favorite part, the three features of interest. We're going to be looking at the manufacturing methods used to make each of these shavers, the complexity inside of each one, and the quality of each one as a product. First up, we're going to look at the manufacturing methods used in each shaver. The Norelco, unsurprisingly, is made primarily of injection molded parts, along with a PCBA and some sheet metal components. The injection molded parts additionally have a variety of details added to them, including overmolded gaskets to help seal against water, painted parts with masking for including the details of the buttons, a thin-walled part with a sticker for the dead-fronted display, and even a clear piece with tinted plastic and an overmold for both the display and buttons. There are some sheet metal components in the Norelco, although there's not a lot of them. There's a couple of simple brackets for holding things into place, 6 screws, 2 of which mount the motor, a couple other little snap fit brackets for holding the PCBA in place, and then of course the foil and the blade. The blade is the most complex part in here, having many little folds, little sharpened edges for actually cutting the hair, and several small little rivets inside to hold this sandwich of parts together. From the electronic side, we have a simple PCBA with a lithium-ion cell soldered directly onto it, and then connected via a removable connector is a stepper motor along the lines of type you'd find in maybe a CD drive or other consumer electronic device. Just like the Norelco, the Series 7 uses injection molded parts with overmolded gaskets for sealing against water, parts with painted on details for external indicators, and also optically clear parts for light transmission. However, the Series 7 also made use of heat-staked inserts for metal and plastic parts to hold things together, as well as glued-in components such as visors and buttons, and even made a much more extensive use of glass-filled injection molded parts, which are harder to injection mold. In terms of metal components, the Series 7 also has significantly more than the Norelco, including some large metal brackets, some pretty heavy riveted metal brackets for the inside, significantly more springs, including torsion springs, more screws, and even some large ballast brackets on the inside. In addition to all this screws and snap fits, the Series 7 also has captive sheet metal assemblies that create a movable yet self-contained subassembly. And on top of all of that, rivets and even welds are used to hold together the Series 7's beefy motor. When it's all laid out, the Norelco is actually fairly simple inside, from the overall design to the small details. Relative to the Series 7, it has a much lower part count, and several of those parts are the same, adding redundancy to the bill of materials and easing assembly. The injection molded parts themselves are overall fairly simple, without overly thick walls or the need for particularly complex tooling. The heavy use of snap fits for both the plastic and metal parts in the Norelco make it simple to assemble and thus more cost effective to make, and also reduces the number of tools needed to take it apart and put it together. The moving parts in the Norelco's head are achieved by having a wide clearance between two parts that are then held against each other with a compression spring. This method does not require tight tolerances to achieve, and yet allows for a wide range of motion and many degrees of freedom in the cutting head. The electronics in the Norelco are even so simple and self-contained that when removed from the device, they still turn on and work just fine. This not only means that this is a simple, self-contained circuit board, but that after this I can put it back together and get myself a free new shaver. Surprisingly, the Series 7 is actually one of the more complex things we've torn down, particularly when you consider all of the pins, screws, and plastic parts that go into making it. Instead of using large clearances and springs for the motion system, the Series 7 actually uses close-fitting pins and plastic bearings to create a nice, clean, linear motion. The PCBA is even more complex, using large copper rails instead of wire to carry power, having a display on it, and even having a flexible portion of the PCB to allow the display to be held at an angle and fit more easily inside the shaver's body. Above and beyond the most complex part in the Series 7 is the motor that runs it all. This thing is not only a custom designed motor, but a pretty custom type of motor that moves linearly instead of spinning like in the other Razor. This thing not only needed a lot of math to design well, but a lot of engineering to actually manufacture all of the compression springs inside, the leaf springs that control the motion, the copper coils, the welding that holds it all together. All of that goes into making this one complex and really cool chunk of metal. And last but not least, we wanted to look at the quality of these products and see what details were added to make them feel like nice, polished pieces. From a design point of view, the Norelco's cutting head has several degrees of freedom and very compliant soft springs that make it easy to move, which makes it feel like it will get much closer to your face for a nice clean shave. Also, there's a very small area where hair and water can fall, meaning it's easy to clean and you don't risk getting the inside of your razor clogged with debris or water that could make it malfunction or just be gross. The dead fronted display, while very easy to make, has a nice effect of blending in with the body of the shaver when it's turned off. Perhaps one of the nicest aspects for a consumer of the Norelco is that you only have to replace the foil and the blades when they get old, versus the Series 7, you have to replace the entire cartridge head, all the springs and pins included. Given all of the engineering detail that went into the inside of the Series 7, it's no surprise that the outside has a lot of details that make it a well-polished product. The use of steel pins and plastic bushings in the cutting head make for a nice, smooth, strong-feeling motion, while the use of spring-loaded cams elsewhere make sure everything satisfyingly locks into place, whether you're locking the position of the cutting head or slapping in a new blade and foil cartridge. Some of the details you can't even see on the shaver but can feel them. For instance, there are steel plates inside that act purely as ballast to make the shaver feel heavier and thus like a higher quality, more substantial product. And speaking of weight, the battery in the Series 7 is much bigger, which means it's heavier, has a higher capacity, and in this case is also removable, which means that you could in theory keep your shaver alive even after the battery cell dies. And the last little detail in the Series 7 that makes a big difference is the inclusion of a small trimmer, which allows the Series 7 to function as a standalone product. After tearing both of these shavers down and looking at the manufacturing methods used, the internal complexity, and the quality of them as a product, in our engineering opinion, this is a great example of taking two different approaches to the same problem and yet coming to a similar solution, as both of these products cost more or less the same amount and thus drive the same amount of value. On the one hand, we had the Philips Norelco, which uses a rotary shaving head with a much simpler design that's much easier to manufacture, cheaper to produce, and thus drives a higher margin for Philips. On the other hand, we have the Braun Series 7, which uses a linear oscillating shaving head and is a much more complex finesse design. However, it is also a standalone product that results in a much more satisfying experience for the customer. But enough of our professional engineering opinion. Let's get a real user perspective from one of our resident fathers. Back to you, Panos.
So for any dad out there, and I guess anyone with a beard, if I were to buy one of those two electric razors, I would buy the Series 7 Braun, just because it has the trimmer. That's very important for me that I had longer beard. I can easily define clear lines, and it just feels as if it can cut a longer hair and just safer and smoother the way I use it on my face.
If you enjoyed this video, want more hardware knowledge, or just want to see what we take apart next, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Fictiv channel.
Ha